Hello, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing our sheltering in place. Let's start with a prayer and then we'll talk about our topic for the day. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, to live in your joy, to have faith that you are guiding both this planet and our individual lives upon it, that everything that happens is to take us to self-realization. Help us to have the courage and the wisdom to accept your will with gratitude. Om. Peace. Amen. We're continuing with a series we're calling On These Principles We Stand, which is taken from the year 1974, page 77 of this book I wrote about Swami Kriyananda year by year about his life. And there are 6 principles that Swamiji wrote out that are the definition of what the Ananda communities are based on. This is not the same as, like in 2003, he wrote something called The Way of the Sanghis, which is really the essential beliefs that define the Ananda Sangha. Everything in creation is a manifestation of Satchidananda. It's quite possible, and later on in this series, that I'll go into that writing. That might be very good to explore now that I think about it. But this was when he was making an Ananda communities movement, and he was trying to talk about the principles of the community's movement itself. What were Master's ideals for community? So far, we've done simplicity, but not primitivism, world compassion, not world rejection, and today we're doing practicality, not utopianism. Ananda often has articulated that there are 3, there's you have the 3 of this and the 5 of this and the 6 of that and the 7 of this, the 8 of that, but in each one sort of is its own system. So I'm talking about these principles that Swami wrote out in 1974, which in fact have not been actually articulated or presented until I found them and put them into the book, even though they do define Ananda, but we've acted upon those principles. It's just they never rose to the level of a handout that was posted on the wall. However, there have been 2 rules at Ananda that we have often quoted, and one is, where there is dharma, there is victory. And that means if you're true to your highest principles, then everything will come out in the best possible way. Not that it will always come out in the world's most convenient manner, but in the end, you will feel inside yourself that you've done the right thing. So whenever Ananda's had any decision, we always choose the honorable course according to what we understand to be dharma, being that action which leads to expanded consciousness. When Ananda was burned down, a lot of it was burned down in a forest fire in 1976 that turned out to have been caused by a faulty spark arrestor on a county vehicle, which is automatic lawsuit material. Many of our neighbors who were burned out entered a lawsuit, but we didn't. Swamiji just felt it was not dharma to get somebody else to pay for your karma. He said, it comes from somewhere, and it comes from our neighbors, and we didn't do it. And we survived. We did fine. Interestingly, Swami observed later that many of the people who sued and got money did not recover as completely as Ananda recovered. That's just one very small example where there's dharma, there's victory. The other one is that people are more important than things, that the purpose of Ananda is not to create buildings and places and systems. The purpose of Ananda is to help people become saints, and that every decision has to be made for the spiritual well-being of the individuals involved, secondarily for whatever it is we're trying to create. Not that what we're trying to create has no value, but it's the same principle as where there's dharma, there's victory. We have to be loyal. So those two are often quoted and well known, but there's a third one, which actually is just as important, which is Swamiji's, you have to be practical in your idealism. And that's something that Master said to Swamiji, and the context was interesting. Swamiji was the head of the monks during the time that the last years of Master's life, and Swami held that position for another decade afterwards. And at one point, there was a man who, when Master was still living, a man came who wanted to join the monastery, but it was self-evident that he was unsuitable for it. He had habits and attitudes, and he was unsuitable. But Swami wanted to help him and took him into the monastery. Now, I believe I have this story correctly, so I apologize in advance if I don't, but this is how I remember it. And it wasn't a realistic idea. And Master knew that he was unsuitable. But since Swami had put himself out for it, Master agreed, and the man lived with him for a month or something like that. But it wasn't his life. It wasn't right for him. And Master said, you have to be practical in your idealism. Ideally, you can bring anybody into the monastery and it'll be a wonderful experience for them. But you also have to be practical. That you can't just operate on wishful thinking. So this principle to be practical and not a practicality, not utopianism. Now, the context of this in 1974 also, as I mentioned earlier in this series of broadcasts, that there was a huge back to the land movement happening. This was the 70s, and there was this breakout from mainstream of society by my group, my tribe, my Ananda tribe, and then my greater generational tribe. This is when the baby boomers just sort of took a right turn or maybe a left turn off of the path that we were supposed to follow, and there was this great surge of energy, really, to go back and live in the country. This was the influence of our previous incarnations as American Indians. A few days ago, I gave a talk that included that in the title, and we were going back to what felt more natural and real to us. So there was a lot of ideas floating around about what was going to happen. And, we would have no private property. We would have no monogamy. All children would belong to everyone. We would not, I'm not talking about Ananda. I'm talking about the greater movement. We would completely repudiate modern life altogether. We wouldn't teach our children to read. We would just be like all kinds of things. We would set up this utopian world. And Swamiji's approach to Ananda, even from the very beginning in his very first book, Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why, which is still unique in the field. It has a slightly different title, but that's basically still what it is. He just said, he said, human nature is not reformed by systems. He said, you can create a new system, he said, but human nature will still find a way to express through it. If you transform human nature, he said, any system will work. It was just a complete reverse of the way people thought about it. So among other things, from the beginning, he set Ananda up on the financial system. The economic system of Ananda has always been, this is not entirely true, because in the Assisi community, they have also they have a monastic model also within it. But Ananda Village was established on the same economic system we know. We work, we get a salary, it's our private money, we can use it in any way we wish. Money that we inherit or earn from other sources, it's our private money. Swami felt the effort required to change our relationship to that system wasn't worth the effort. He was going to put the effort into changing our consciousness so that instead of abusing that system, we would use it for the benefit of all. And what, of course, has happened for the most part is that without ever demanding it, people think of the good of the whole community. And people live modestly and are generous with what money they do have and don't use their financial position to have power over other people, because the impulse to do that has been dealt with through the practice of meditation and the other values that we live with, rather than trying to take away, rather than trying to control people's wrong attitudes by creating a system that will prevent them from being able to express it. That's what America has become, especially recently. We have Dwapara Yuga energy, which is this rising dynamic realization that we are energy and have unlimited energy. But we have Kali Yuga consciousness, which wants to put everything into form and make rules and control and set it up and make the world work by defining it exactly. So we have this system of extraordinary number of laws that are all designed to keep anybody from stepping out of line, and also to protect you from ever being taken advantage of by any circumstance. And we're drowning in this, that we become such a litigious society that anytime anything happens, somebody can sue somebody in here. I have to laugh. There was a man at Ananda Village, a very dear friend of mine, and he was a bookseller. This would have happened, like, his son is now about 40, so this was a number of years ago. And he was living at Ananda Village, which is at a distance from urban areas, but he had always been a bookseller, and he was very, very knowledgeable about valuable books, old books. So he set up this whole business online. He was a single father supporting a 2-year-old son, and he was able to run this business from Ananda Village, where he wanted to be with his child, because it was all online. And he had his son on his lap one day when he was doing some work. And to this day, he's not quite sure how it happened, but somehow his 2-year-old son erased his business. No matter what effort they made, he couldn't get it back. It was gone. And he literally had to pick up and move to another colony and start a whole other enterprise, because his entire form of livelihood was wiped out by a child on the keyboard. I mean, I know it sounds incredible, but it actually happened. So there was another man in the community who was an attorney. And when he heard this story, he kept saying, there must be a lawsuit in there somewhere. Inconceivable that there could be a law that says if your 2-year-old child accidentally hits these buttons and you lose your enterprise, you can sue somebody. But that's exactly where we are. We're just in this world where we're trying to make everybody just be right, make this world exactly the way it's supposed to be. Now, that's a form of utopianism. It's more like dystopia, but it's a word I recently learned. But it's also a form of utopianism. We're going to make this world exactly right. And Swamiji has always followed Master's teaching. You have to be practical in your idealism. You have to realize that perfection is directional. And that's another really important teaching that Master offered us. It's not a matter of you have to be perfect. It's that we need to be moving in the direction that we're trying to go. And it's far better to do something practical that will actually result in some tangible positive expression than it is to demand an unreasonable perfection that no system, no community, and no person can meet, and then set yourself up so that unless we can do that, we can't do anything. Master often told the story about a cooperative living situation that he visited, and he heard about. This is a story that Master tells, where this man had been living in this idyllic community, because there have been communities started for a long period of time. But the principle of that community was consensus. Everybody had to agree on everything. Was the utopian principle that they had. Nobody would be left behind. All decisions would be made because they agreed. And then, and the way the story is told, one night, one group wanted to have tapioca pudding, and the other wanted to have apple pie. And eventually the entire community collapsed because they couldn't agree on what they should have for dessert. Master said to the men afterwards, "Why didn't half of you have apple pie and the other half have tapioca pudding?" And the man says, "We never thought of that." Because the idea in their mind had been, we always have to agree. That's a utopian ideal. But in practical terms, often very sincere people will have very different points of view. And it's just not practical. And this was among the issues why Swami stuck with an ordinary economic system. He said, with an ordinary economic system, you don't have to have an enormous system to ensure that people work. Because if they don't work, they don't get paid, and they don't have any money to live. If you have a communitarian, a communal system, then some people will do more work than others, and they may begin to resent those who do less work, and then you have to have a system to police those who do less work, and because human nature is the issue. But then even with human nature, you have to be practical. You have to realize that not everyone is equally talented. Not everyone is equally at peace with themselves. And what has worked with Ananda, so sometimes we get criticized. I'm going to go on like this. In the early 80s, when there was still the enthusiasm for communities was very high, and I'm hoping that the enthusiasm for communities will come back, which I think after this epidemic is over, and unfortunately, if there are serious economic problems after this, the idea of cooperating and pooling resources and working together, I think, is going to look more attractive to people, and human values will come back more into play. But in the 80s, when there was still a lot of interest in communities, one of the flourishing communities, which is still a dynamic community, many of our companions in the communities movement simply have ceased to exist. The average, Swamiji said, the average life of a community in the 1970s was 60 days. It's just like people would get together with all these ideals and they would run smack into human nature. But one of the flourishing ones was Findhorn. And at that time, their founder, Peter Caddy, was still living and was still the leader of the community. Peter had a very strong influence on that community. And at a certain point, they actually parted company. The founder and the community parted company. But he was still the focal point of it. And he was a friend of Ananda, and I knew him. I was an acquaintance of his, let me phrase it differently. I was present when he came to visit Swamiji. So I knew him in that respect. So there was this big conference in the 80s in Oregon, and Peter Caddy was there representing Findhorn, and there must have been at least 100 people there, and everybody was interested in communities, but only a few of us actually had one. And I was there, and Ananda was now, like it had been in existence since 1968, so we were 15 years. I had a whole slideshow of all the things that we'd done in a presentation, and I'm a fairly entertaining speaker, and the pictures were nice. I couldn't get anybody to listen to me. I just couldn't get an audience anywhere in that conference. And yet, tremendous attention was given to these 5 people who showed us all pictures of land they hoped to acquire. And if they managed to buy it, then they hoped to be able to build a community on it. And everybody was giving them all this attention and conversation. And they were talking about what they were going to do when they had their community and how this system would be in place and that. And I didn't take it personally, but I was just a little bewildered. So Findhorn's approach to everything was quite different than ours. We are disciples of Paramhansa Yogananda, and we meditate. That's our life. God realization is our goal. Findhorn was doing these remarkable things, cooperating with the nature devas and growing huge cauliflowers in the snow, and just all together creating a utopian environment, seemingly. So I said to Peter, I have 15 years of community experience. Ananda is one of the most remarkable successes. I said, everybody wanted to hear about Findhorn. Everybody wanted to know about his cabbages in the winter and about all the other wonderful things that they were doing, because there was good reason to pay attention. I said, everybody wants to talk to you. Nobody wants to talk to me. I said, what is this? And Peter, bless his heart, he said, Asha, he said, Findhorn promises heaven on earth. He said, you keep telling people that they have to leave earth to get to heaven. He said, nobody wants to do that. And it was just perfectly true. And I knew exactly what he meant. And I said, yeah, that's exactly right. You know, utopianism is more popular, because if you promise people that everything's going to change and it's all going to be just as we actually know it could be. You see, this is the very confusing thing about this utopianism versus practicality, because our ideals, Swamiji's ideals, are infinite in their possibility and perfect in their expression. It's not as if the utopia that people dream of is not also our goal. It's just there's a difference between inner perfection and outer perfection. And I think where some people get confused is that they have this idea that the longing that we feel inside ourselves for a perfect fulfillment that we know is possible can be manifested in the external world if we just get together and do it. When we finished the production of Finding Happiness, the movie that you can find online, which is about Ananda, it's a beautiful film. And we were airing it around in the area, and sometimes when we aired it, I or others would go to answer questions. And one of the big shows that we did in one of the local movie theaters, I stood up afterwards and someone asked me a question, which is an obvious question. Does a community have to have a spiritual base in order to be successful? Which is a question we get asked a lot, because not everybody wants to have a spiritual base. They want to just be as they are, but have everything work out a lot better. And I said, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be spiritual, but I will tell you this from my life experience. The problem with community is other people. And of course, that is the definition of community, isn't it? That there have to be other people, or else you don't have a community. Otherwise, you just have yourself. So you have all those other people, and you're out on some beautiful piece of land, you're living as we are in a very nice little place in the city, and whatever it might be, but there's all those other people. And other people and this people, all people, have a commitment to their own egoic ideas. And I don't mean necessarily even egotistical ideas, but just egoic, the ideas that are connected to my reality. Because I was raised this particular way, this is what I want. Because these are my values, this is what I want. And when you just have a whole series of egoic ideas like this, sometimes the opinions simply clash. And there's just no way that you can necessarily resolve, because each has integrity on its own level. I said, so what you have to have is you have to have some ideal that is bigger and more magnetic than people's commitment to their egoic preferences, so that they will have a reason to voluntarily relinquish their egoic preferences in favor of another ideal. So there has to be this overarching to which everyone is attuned. And people can do it for organic gardening. They can do it for alternate energy. They can do it for what? But you see, there's a certain point at which organic gardening may not be strong enough and magnetic enough for people to let go of their egoic preferences. But God is, especially as Master presented it, Sat Chit Ananda, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss, in which, we understand that what we're seeking through the fulfillment of our egoic preferences will actually come to us by appropriately relinquishing them, meaning at the right time and for the right reason, we relinquish them in favor of a higher ideal. And that's what makes a community, that's what holds a community together. Now, as I said, it doesn't have to be God, but it has to have some reality that's big enough to do that. That's part of the practicality of that master's teaching is based on. You have to be practical about human nature. You can't just have wishful thinking and imagine that if we're all eating organic food, that we won't have any other conflicts. People have often asked me, what's your conflict resolution plan at Ananda? And I had to say honestly, we don't have one because we haven't needed one. And I'm not being unrealistic in that, because it's not that we've never disagreed with each other, but all of us, we look to each other, but primarily we look upward. And so faith in God is actually the fundamental practicality we have. And Swamiji says the most practical thing in the world is faith. Faith based on experience. So that brings us back to the practice of meditation. And Swami has often commented that, the community is a byproduct of our search for God. It's not like we've started out to make this world perfect. We started out to make ourselves perfect. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Jesus said, that's our ideal. And community greatly supports the search for God realization. It creates a God-reminding environment. It gives you relationships that also support you in your spiritual search. It gives you the grist for the mill so that you can sort of rub up against the people with whom the karma is a little more tricky. And then you get to try to resolve those issues, in the direction of God in an upward moving way. And all of that is the most practical thing of all. But we're also practical in our idealism in the sense that we just don't expect perfection. We recognize right from the start that we're all in this together. There's a very funny story the way Jyotish and Devi tell it about this, that there was someone that they've had an overall responsibility for Ananda for most of their lives. And Jyotish is Swami Kriyananda's successor. They're worldwide directors. And they were trying to work something out with one man who had a certain job in the community. And this was early on in the time of their responsibilities. And they were sort of talking to Swami about this man and who had certain obvious shortcomings. Swamiji said, I think he's doing extremely well, considering who he is. I mean, that was just practical in his idealism. Practicality, not utopianism. The man is not perfect, but considering who he is, he's doing really well. Then Jyotish and Devi described how later things were not, they were getting a lot of people questioning their leadership and so on, which, just happens. And so they were asking Swami, are we all right? Are we doing our job well? Swami said, I think you're doing very well, considering who you are. And he said it partly as a joke, and they presented the story as a joke, because that's as well as you can do. You can do as well as you are, considering who you are. But oddly, rather than that diminishing your potential to be practical rather than utopian in what you're planning to do, you actually come closer to utopia. Because when you're practical, you can move step by step. It's not an all or nothing. And we celebrate the progress. And with God realization as the goal, that ultimately progress will come. And utopia is not nowhere. Utopia is somewhere, but it's within us. So that too, simplicity, compassion for the world, and practicality, realizing what we can accomplish, and then giving ourselves wholeheartedly to manifesting it. These are the principles on which we stand. God bless you.